Okay, James chapter 5, 1 through 6. Turn there if you have your Bibles. And this is not a long section, but it's an important one. And it's going to deal with the Christian's attitude toward riches and money and how you get it and what you do with it. So some very fundamental, important issues. Let me start with James 5, verse 1. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, your moths have eaten your clothes, your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Then in verse 4, look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You fatten yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Now, as we begin this section, this is very much in the line of teaching from a wisdom perspective. It is interesting in Old Testament wisdom literature. There are sayings and attention paid to wealth and riches and how you handle them. And so as James is New Testament wisdom, we're not surprised that he deals with this. It's a very practical matter, though. How we handle riches, material possessions, money, all of that, how we handle that in a way demonstrates where we are spiritually, and where we are spiritually and our thinking about it is going to affect how we handle it. And so it's real crucial. Now he starts off with this expression, now listen. And it is the grabbing attention of his readers because of the seriousness of what's going on. And here's the big question that comes up. He says, now listen, you rich people. The plural indicates maybe it's several in the congregation that he's addressing. Some people think that it may be just the rich out in the community that are not Christians. I think I kind of favor that he's addressing, first of all, individuals in the assembly and congregation that he knows that this is going to apply, though I think he's hoping that, and think about this is a fascinating thing for me, and I know you've thought about this. When we assemble in Bible class, when we assemble on Sunday morning in the greater assembly, there's always preaching and teaching that goes on that promotes Christian thinking, Christian living, and however you want to describe that. But we, most of the time, realize that we're kind of speaking to ourselves. However, sometimes someone comes in who's not a Christian. Somebody walks in off the street and they hear what is going on. Sometimes we recognize that what we say among ourselves is heard by other people, and we hope that they get the message too. And this may be the dynamic that's going on here. But you rich ones, and it's plural, and it may indicate that there are several in the congregation assembling there that he's actually speaking to. And if that's true, again, a fascinating phenomenon in the New Testament. It is rare for for the New Testament writers, when they address a problem or what I want to call it, a wrong teaching, wrong behavior, when they're addressing things, even when they're urgent. I mean, I'm thinking like the book of Galatians. In Galatians, such a urgent issue in that letter. It's just amazing to me that the writers don't put people's names down. Rare is the occasion that they name somebody by name. If it is true that these are rich ones in the congregation, he doesn't name them by name. And I've often wondered if this is on purpose, teaching the listeners to learn how to identify both the problem and how you apply the answer. Because otherwise, if you do it just by naming people, if I just name somebody, well, then the problem's over with. I'm just, out with you, you're done, let's move on to something else. And it may not be anybody learns anything from that experience. Yeah, Bill?
This is not a judging situation by hierarchy, but this is put upon the individuals to do their own judging of themselves.
Yes, very much so. Exactly. You don't get the sense that Paul or Peter or James or anybody is saying, okay, we're going to deal with this problem, and the leaders of the church, they have to have the solution. Here's how you do it. No, it's addressed to all the readers, isn't it, and listeners, so that every individual has the responsibility to sit up and take notice. Oh, is he talking about me? Or if he's not, is there something here I can learn? I think you're exactly right with that. And then he has a command here. And this command is to weep. Weep, howl, cry aloud. It is used in the Septuagint, that's the Greek Old Testament where it occurs, as expressions of what you might call violent grief. Think about the worst situation that you've experienced someone having grief and expressing that. And that there is this howling and this crying aloud and this just emotive kind of weeping. Well, it's that dynamic that James is saying his listeners need to engage in. So this is really, really strong language. Like, okay. And if we have time, we could go back and look at those passages in the Old Testament. But a lot of times the prophets will call upon God's people to weep because of what they have done, their sins, how bad they've gotten themselves, bad situations they've gotten themselves into. And it's a command of weeping that includes sort of confession and repentance all wrapped up together. And it's meant to express the deep inner pain that precedes change. And that's a lesson in itself, isn't it? Okay. But he wants them to weep, wailing because of the misery that's coming upon you. The coming misery because of their sin, of what they're involved in. We'll talk about that sin here in a minute. But turn to Romans 3:16. I thought this was an interesting use by Paul on this whole concept of misery as it's related to sin. And this is interesting because this is in Romans chapter 3 where he's making the case that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And on the one hand, he says, now, if you think about it, the Jews should have had an advantage. Given their background and all of the teaching that they've received through the years, they should have been ready. And he goes, well, what advantage then was it for a Jew to be a Jew? He says in every way. But most of them didn't take advantage of their advantage. And so because of that, he makes the case, what shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. This is Romans 3:9. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. And the first 3 chapters of Romans is driving down to that point. He's laid his case out, and I want you to know now that everybody's alike. Doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile, all are under sin. And then he quotes this passage from Psalm 140. There is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. Now, this is pretty strong language, and I don't think he means, if you were to actually do it in numbers, there would be a few people, but the way he's categorically saying it this way to make his point. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery, there's the word misery. Ruin and misery mark their ways. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So this kind of wailing and misery because of sin, it's even picked up on by Paul. And so this is what James is saying here in chapter 5, that the kind of misery that he's warning them of is all wrapped up in a life that's separate from the will of God. Okay, now the next point is, he says, because of that, your wealth has rotted or stands in a condition of being rotten. It is rotten. Now, because it's rotten, what do you think of when you think of something that's rotten? You normally think of food, don't you? So let's try in our minds, how do you put together wealth and something being rotten? Because that's not the two terms we would put together. So what do you think he's saying here? Your wealth is rotten. Is it sort of metaphorical, where that we would say today about something that's not any good, well, that's just rotten? Is he saying it that way, or is it literally something rotten? What do you think? Anybody want to take a guess? Maybe somewhere in between those two?
Use it, it goes bad.
It goes bad. And here's why I'm asking this, is because when we think of wealth, if we're not careful, we tend to restrict it to money, don't we? But think about these guys who apparently, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, who are landowners. Part of their wealth is some of their crops. And because of the way he describes how they've been living, and we'll see that expression here in a moment, it may be that they have so much they don't know what to do with it. And some of the fruit or the crops is just lying there rotten because they've got so much. And they're being stingy with it and not giving it to people who need it. So it could be a literal reference. Some people opt for that, then others say, well, it just means kind of like what we'd say, well, that's no good, it's just rotten, Well, it's hard to know exactly which one, but I find it fascinating that he is using that word rotten to describe their wealth. Okay? Now, we do know, we've already seen this in an earlier chapter, that their wealth was often evident in the types of clothes that they wore. Many of them, woven linen, silk. This is why he uses the description, look at this description, that it is, what's the word he uses? Moths have eaten your clothes. So, the moth-eaten clothes. Let's think about a moment what James is trying to say with this. Landowners, royalty, there would be individuals in the upper crust of society who would have this kind of clothing that is much more ornate, much more expensive. But what he wants to draw their attention to is the fact that that kind of clothing is susceptible to being eaten by moths. And what does that indicate? First of all, I think the temporary nature of the material itself and that wealth itself is temporary. So there's something amazingly metaphorical about this moth-eaten clothing. And there's another thing that dawned on me today. Often in the ancient world, it was difficult to protect your clothes from moth-eaten, to being moth-eaten. But that's why they would try to use, pieces of cedar. There'd be natural ways they'd try to fight that. They didn't have mothballs like we do today. But they would have natural ways they would try to fight that. But it is amazing if you've ever come across any expensive clothing that has been moth-eaten. It's amazing the damage that moths can do. And so it does point out the temporary nature of this kind of wealth that he's talking about, and that they're not able often to protect it from that.
It doesn't have to be expensive either.
That's true. It doesn't. Yeah. Now, he's then going to move to another thing about your gold and your silver are corroded. And we would say tarnished, but it means, the word here used means to rust out, to rust through. It's gold and silver tarnished or being corroded. I saw this picture, and this comes from an individual, I think, that had been in the Palestine area doing some excavation. And you have ancient coins. And look what happens to coins over time. And you all have picked up maybe an old penny that's been in the ground for a long time. But it's just amazing what time does to things that are gold and silver. And you tend to think, well, gold and silver will always be in premier condition. Well, no. And so he's trying to remind them and so you have to remember, gold and silver in the time of James would be the best retirement plan you could have. I mean, that was their IRA, okay? Your gold and your silver. And he's trying to remind them, as we often are reminded, that your financial holdings are not as secure as you think they are, okay? And you get the impression they are sort of showing this off. They want others to know that they've got this gold and silver. It becomes a status symbol. And James is saying, no, that's not the case. In fact, the very thing that you're putting your faith in is going to end up being tarnished and corroded. In fact, it is interesting that the compound verb that James uses means something like rust all the way through. Yeah, it's really corroded. It's not worth much. When something rusts all the way through, we're generally done with it, aren't we? Let somebody else deal with it. And then there's something that's fascinating, and it's what I call corrosive testimony. And I want you to listen to how he paints this picture. It's incredible. Their corrosion, that's the gold and silver, their corrosion will testify against you. So it's like you're looking at that gold and silver that has corroded and it's tarnished, and that very corrosion is a testimony against you. and that corrosion will eat your flesh like fire. Wow, what an image. I mean, that is really strong. So what he's saying then is, where you have put all of your trust, you have placed all of your identity, and where you think your security is, he's providing them a whole different way of looking at this. They are not as secure as they think they are. Now, here's what this really challenges us with, and it's hard because we have to think through this. And most of us in here are at retirement age or already there or whatever. Where is our security? And we know that we have to have finances at a certain level to survive, and we do want to be secure, but for the Christian, there's a whole different way in which the mind frames that. Okay? Probably a good place to start is in what we call the Lord's Prayer. See, who is it that provides us with our daily bread? It's God the Father. Our security is in His provision. It doesn't take much, and we've all experienced this. You may have what you think is a golden goose egg, and it's really nice. And all of a sudden, forces outside your control render that goose egg nothing. I've been there before. You're like, what? I didn't get any say-so in how that ended up. It's not worth anything now. Well, and I think this is kind of what James is after. Being a Christian recognizes there are forces beyond our control that if we put all of our security in that very thing, we're going to be shocked because the security won't be there like we're thinking that it will be. One of the things that I've heard the last several years from individuals is that they thought that they retired with a real good retirement package only to find out that the company they worked for either took away their pension plan or revised it or took away their health care plan, and just on they got chopped away at till finally what they thought was good and secure was gone. And that causes people all kinds of problems. And that's natural because we want to be secure. We want to make sure we've got something to live on. But again, even that is outside our control, isn't it? Which is also kind of scary because we like for things to be kind of within our control so we can make sure nothing happens. Well, still, things outside our control we just can't do anything about. So I think he's getting at this. It reminds me next of turn to Matthew chapter 6, because there's a couple principles in Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus is going to address that I think are very pertinent here. Matthew chapter 6. Let me turn over there real quick. And this begins with verse 25. Notice he addresses this within the context of worrying about the basic needs of life. I suspect that the individuals in the book of James that have all this gold and silver and have all these clothes that some ending up being moth-eaten, but I suspect that part of the dynamic as to why they gather all that is they're trying to make it such that they won't have to worry about the basic things of life being provided for them. But that's not a guarantee in and of itself. In Matthew chapter 6, he says, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. This is really a strong admonition in Jesus' day because people really did live from, what's it called, hand to mouth, from day to day. You didn't know a lot of times where your meal was coming from tomorrow. Many work, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but the predominant way for workers to be paid back then was a daily worker. You got paid every day, but you were a daily worker. And so life was lived much closer on the edge than it is for many of us. Many of us have never had to live like that, Mark.
Even Natasha saw that on a daily basis in Africa.
Oh, yeah.
It was, Kevin said at one point that a lot of families, the women would eat on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The men would eat on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and nobody would eat on Sunday, or there was basically,
Wow.
they were that close to the edge.
My. Boy, that really is.
And a lot of the social unrest, when they have riots, they only last for a day because if they don't work, they don't eat.
Yeah. Wow. So did some of you hear that? That on, what was it? The women would eat on Monday, Wednesday,
Every other day.
every other day.
Yes.
Yeah. Women would eat Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The guys would eat the other alternative days. That really is living on the edge, isn't it? And in the country in which we live, it is hard for us to fathom that. But you see, Jesus is addressing a culture in which living on the edge was common for a lot of people. Now, in the book of James, that's true, but the ones that he's writing to, he's actually addressing the ones that's causing the problem. And let's look back in James again, and I want us to see what the problem is. This begins, well, I have a statement that I want to say before I get there. James is saying possessions will possess you and eat you alive if you allow it. If you have the wrong attitude and you have the wrong approach and you're looking at your security being there and whatever, your possessions will end up possessing you and eat you alive. I mean, it's a really strong approach to this. And that you have hoarded and treasured up and stored up in a miserly and self-centered way. And that's really, because notice, kind of a neat, you have hoarded wealth in the last days. And down in verse 5, we'll get to it. You've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. So he's painted a picture here of individuals who have done well. In a minute, we're going to find out how they did so well, but they've done well. And what they've done is they've lived in luxury, self-indulgence, and they've hoarded it up. There is a delightful story. Man, who's the author? Some of you may know this. When I was in the probably 7th grade, our English teacher had us read a condensed version of the novel Silas Marner. Have any of you ever read the story of Silas Marner? Last year, I downloaded for free an early copy of it that is the whole novel, and I didn't realize how condensed it had been when I read it. I think not only is it long, but it's the writer style is very picturesque. So there's a lot of extra words in it, but it's the story of one who was so miserly in how he lived by himself and hoarded his wealth, and then all of a sudden somebody steals it and it's gone, and he has to learn that there's more to life than just all this money that he kept hoarding up, and how he just kept to himself and was very self-indulgent. And I'm not quite at this part of the story, but I remember from earlier reading that this child comes into his life, and he learns what love is, and it's a lot different than hoarding wealth. But it's a classic story, and I can't remember the author. I was trying to think of the author, but it's really is a classic novel about this very thing. And you have treasured up in the last days. There's a little bit of discussion on what that phrase means, but it's a warning. And this is one of the reasons I think most of the people he's writing to are Christians. If he were writing this and his main audience were not Christian, the concept of the last days wouldn't really mean much to them. For Christians, the last days encapsulates a couple of concepts. One is that judgment is coming and Christ is returning. And it is the culmination of the ages, or the age in which you live. And it's a culmination of your life coming before God in judgment. And so you've treasured up in the last days. He's saying this also because they're living so much in luxury, it has blinded them to the fact that their life has a destiny and they'll be required to answer for how they've lived their life. In other words, they've treasured up, but not the things that they think. Rather, it's the corrosive witness against themselves. They've treasured up silver and gold and all these clothes, but that's not what is really going to be the witness against them. And it's not the treasure they think they've got. They've treasured up something else, and it's called judgment. Now, this is where we get into, he says, the wage of the workman having harvested your fields. And we talked a little bit about the day worker in the ancient world. I want to look at Matthew 20. Turn over to Matthew 20, 1 through 16, because this is about the laborers in the vineyard being paid. Matthew 20. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard, and he agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them out into his vineyard. So you've got this owner of the kingdom, and he's paying people to go out and work. And notice that a day's wage, and this was very traditional, a denarius was a day's wage. And I don't have a picture, but if you can go online, you can see a picture of a denarius. About the third hour, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. And see, usually that's what would happen. You would go to a certain place in the marketplace, and your landowners would come in the morning, and they would pick people out to come and work for them. Well, if you didn't get picked, you just stood there, hoping maybe somebody else would come by and pick you. And he says, he told them, you also go and work in my vineyard, and I'll pay you whatever is right. So they went out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did the same. And about the 11th hour, he went out and still found others standing. I can't imagine, think about standing there all day, and right toward the end, he asked them, why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing? Because no one has hired us, they answered. He said, well, you also go and work in my vineyard. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first. And then, of course, we know how this looks. The workers who were hired about the 11th hour came and each received a denarius. And so when those who came were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each of them received a denarius. And when they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. And these men who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. Boy, this sounds just like us, doesn't it? And we are like them. We do not want anything to look like it's not equal. Okay? But he answered one of them, friend, I'm not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. And I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first and the first will be last. That last question is incredible. Are you envious because I'm generous? Wow. Would we even think of ourselves being envious of the gracious generosity of God? And of course, as you know, the traditional Christian interpretation of applying this, as far back as I can find, is you worry that, okay, I've lived a Christian all my life. Yeah, the Lord will give me heaven. But here's somebody that gives a deathbed confession and they get in too. That is not fair. And that's how our human minds work. Well, the generous grace of God. Well, it is. Exactly, it is. And it makes you aware that the person's heart is not in the right place. And if you extended this parable a little bit, you could almost say that the workers who had the right mindset, they got the same amount that I got at the end of the day, but I am thankful they got a job because they too have a family. And that would take a lot of maturity for a person to say that, wouldn't it? Okay, but this is a great example of the day worker, the day laborer, and then getting paid every day. Back in James, the cries of the harvesters. This is the painful experience of the unjust treatment by these harvesters by being defrauded. Notice exactly what's going on. Well, it may depend on how you define defraud, but he says,
he said, you hired up for this price, and you get paid what you hired for.
Well, I'm back in James 5, I'm sorry. In James 5, chapter 5, verse 4, you're right with that, Bill, if I was still in Matthew. The wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. So these landowners are holding back part of their paycheck. Yeah. They're holding back part of their paycheck. And that's how they're getting more money in their pocket. Here's something we need to think about. Are you aware? Of course, you who are sitting here tonight, I know you're aware, but is our Christian community at large, is the church at large aware that a crucial, and I mean really crucial, measurement of our spiritual growth and maturity is how we handle our money? I have run across people through the years that have expressed it in one way or another, that my money is mine to deal with, and it doesn't mix with my spiritual life. Boy, the New Testament doesn't know anything about that. How I handle my monetary matters, and how I treat others regarding money matters is crucial in my spiritual life. Of course, when you say that, then it opens up all kinds of scenarios, and I'm aware of that. But when money comes in the picture, and here's where I first became aware of this. Nancy and I had not been married long, and I was working for the First Congregation in West Tennessee, Bradford, Tennessee. And the president of the bank was a member of our congregation. So on Monday morning, when I go by and deposit my check in the bank, he said, "Come back here, I want to talk to you." And it dawned on me, we hadn't been there long, he needed me just to debrief. And so I'd have coffee with him, and he would say, "Now, don't say a word, but so-and-so, here's what they're doing with their money, and it can't be right." I mean, he ended up retiring from that role because it just ate him up. He saw so many people that he thought were Christians, and they claimed to be, but they were doing all sorts of shady things, unethical things with their money, and it just blew his mind. And at that young, of course, I would have been probably in my early 20s. That's when it really opened up to me how that a lot of people just kind of have the feeling, my money's mine to do with. And that's my world. Lord's kind of over here with Sunday. Keep him over there because this is my world. I thought, wow. And I've seen that through the years. People just have that sort of split mentality that, here's my money and here's the Lord. Never the twain shall meet, which is really unbiblical. The reason, think about why these harvesters are crying out. They're being treated unjustly, but they can't provide for their family. They're not getting paid what they're supposed to get paid, probably scraping by, and no recourse to redress their complaints. Who do you go to? Apparently there was no union. This was the day before unions. No union. So they're out there just barely scraping by, and they're being defrauded, cheated by these landowners. Now what's interesting is both the Old Testament, and there's two good passages here, one in Leviticus 19 and the other one in Deuteronomy 24, and also in rabbinic teaching, if you wanted to run down Strachan Billerbeck's work, chapter 1, section 1, I think it actually is, and line 832, gives you the rabbinic teaching on this, but both Old Testament and rabbinic teaching required that workers be paid at the end of the day, and that pay be honest. And the withholding of wages by the rabbis was supposed to be one of the four sins that they said that the sin in and of itself, because wages were being withheld, that in and of itself would cry to heaven that God would hear quickly when people were being cheated like this. It reached the ears of the Almighty. This is an anthropomorphism. You get a good long word tonight. Anthropomorphism. It's where some figure of the human body is attributed to God. And the reason for that is that it comes into the ears. It's in a perfect tense which emphasizes that the cries come to the ear of the Lord. They remain there. So he doesn't forget, and they're not in vain cry out. They're crying out, the Lord God Almighty of hosts, the Lord of hosts. And that's an expression which means like a big army, angelic army. Spiritual army. He's the Almighty Lord of hosts. So that God sees. Boy, as I was pulling this lesson together, here's what really kind of hit me. I didn't have time to delve into it. Think of all the places all over the world today where people are barely scraping by, and it's all because they're being cheated. And they're crying out against that injustice. If James is right, I think God hears those kind of cries. I think God is sensitive to. His ears hear those kind of cries. And if that is true, then what touches God's heart through what he hears like that ought to touch us. We also should be concerned with injustice where people are being cheated, and it's just almost intolerable for them to live. So the Lord cares about justice. In Revelation 15:3, on my Sunday night class, we were in chapter 15, and this is part of a prayer. Maybe it's a song. They're not really sure which one. But these seven angels together sing this song, or they say this prayer together. And part of it is, great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. God is identified as being one whose ways are just and true. The Lord cares about justice. 1 John 1:9, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just, and he'll forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. God being just is a significant claim of his very being, both Old and New Testament. God is just, and because God is just, he cares about injustice. He says, you've lived in soft luxury your whole life, James says to his readers, to give yourself pleasure. It's the prominent idea that their self-indulgence has been going without distinct reference to squandering. He doesn't really say that they squandered all this, but they may have. But if they did, it was on themselves. It's this luxury, self-indulgent, hoarding, and not caring about anyone else. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. This is a fascinating use of the word heart here. And as I was looking at some commentaries, they're not sure what to make of this. Because you would think what it would read, it would be something like, you have fattened your bodies in the day of slaughter. Why do you think James used the word heart here? Because you don't think of fattening your heart, you think of fattening the body. So why is this little twist and turn of language? What do you think he's trying to say here?
You weaken its strength.
Oh. Okay.
You keep it in where it does not get out and get exercised so that the meat is tender.
Yeah, and so the heart is weakened. Oh, okay, I like that. Any others? Why would James use heart here? You fatten your heart. I can hear your wheels turning. It's when I first noticed this, it hit me. I thought, wow, okay, fatten your heart. Joe, what guess do you have on that?
I think it goes to a way of thinking, and it's kind of like circumcising the heart.
Oh, okay, good, yeah. We talk about, and Paul talks a lot about this, circumcision of the heart. It's a physical thing, but your heart, okay? Yeah, so the fattening of your heart. It's a way of thinking, which means, okay, you have focused your heart on living in such a way that you've become so fat, self-indulgent, luxurious, and it's almost like he's using a metaphor here. He keeps going with it. What you don't realize is you're fattening yourself up for your own slaughter. And this goes back to his warning with the last days. It's kind of like payday someday. Well, this is a rather interesting way to put this. Your heart's in the wrong place, and because it's in the wrong place, you're fattening yourself up for your own slaughter, and you don't even know it. Wow. Yeah. Your pleasures and what your heart desires and kind of what you, wrap yourself around, and it's all about you. Oh, yeah. So, and so here's, and as a result, what he's saying is this is what's really going on spiritually with you. What's amazing to me, let's assume again that he is writing to some of these individuals that are parts of the assembly or the congregation there. It makes you want to ask the question, how could they be so far off base with their whole mindset and heart of living like this way and still claim to be Christian? Have Christians been off base before and since? Do we sometime create religion to be what we want it to be? See, think how, what James doesn't delve into, boy, I wished he had of here, because he's painted the picture of all these guys. Wouldn't it have been interesting if he would have included all the ways that he knew they justified how they were living this way? What we don't have is their own mental justifications. Probably wouldn't be hard for us to guess some of those, but they've justified themselves, and James said, no, payday someday. Well, let's pick up there next week, and appreciate you all being here tonight.